Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we're going to talk with author and professional genealogist Maureen Wlodarczyk. Maureen has written several books that highlight the stories of people that lived in New Jersey, including some that she's related to. We're going to talk about the importance of genealogy and genealogy research, and Maureen's going to give us some advice for how to conduct your own research and what resources you can use to tell your own story. So sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. All right, Maureen, welcome to the show. How many books have you written?
Well, I've written 4 books, Mark. The first one is sort of a genealogical memoir for my family, Past Forward, a 3-decade and 3,000-mile journey home. And then we found a wayward relative, and that led to book number 2, Young and Wicked, The Death of a Wayward Girl. And keeping on the theme of people behaving badly, we had Canary in a Cage, the Smith-Bennett murder case. And then we went to Jersey Then Again, all about interesting, quirky, uniquely Jersey kind of people.
Great. Now, your second book, Young and Wicked, The Death of a Wayward Girl, is the story of William Flannelly and Polly Sexton and their downward spiral. Can you tell me about William and Polly?
I can. In my genealogical research, I happened upon William, more likely known as Willie Flannelly, born in the early 1870s to Irish immigrants, and a child criminal by the time he was about 8 or 9 years old in Jersey City. He turned out to be not one of my Flannellys in direct line, but in fact my great-grandmother's second cousin, and our family was also in Jersey City in the same time period. Polly was born in the 4th Ward in Manhattan in the mid-1870s, very tough neighborhood similar to that in Gangs of New York. The 5 Points area, every bit as bad. Her family eventually relocated to Jersey City, and by the age of 8, she was being arrested in Jersey City for stealing live chickens, I guess to bring home for dinner, and pickpocketing little bits of pottery from an emporium for her mother to give as gifts to her mother. And eventually, Polly's family, they lost her father to cancer, and they moved onto the very same street as Willie's family. And these 2 youngsters, young teenagers, crossed paths, and they weren't good apart, and they were worse together. And the book is about, you're right, the downward spiral of their young lives that led to them fleeing Jersey City, where the police were looking for them. And 4 months later, hiding in the Bowery, only 4 months later for her to be dead and he to be accused of killing her.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what was the outcome of that? Did he actually...
He did admit to shooting her. He said, first he said just that he shot her, and they had an angry argument in a flop house on Christie Street in the Bowery. But then he said that she had the gun, and he was trying to leave her, and she was struggling with him, and she was shot accidentally. He was charged with first-degree murder, and he wound up in the Tombs. And when you think the story's over, because he's been arrested, as in cases of history, time and time again, the second part of the story is his journey through the judicial system in the era of the post-Boss Tweed and the corruption. And he has a lawyer who wears diamond studs to court notoriously and would be disbarred later. And it goes on, a coroner who's accused of misconduct. And the police detective who arrested him would eventually become, he was a very crooked policeman, he would eventually become the owner of the New York Yankees. So you, as is always the case in history, turn the corner and get a surprise.
Right.
So it's a 2-part story in that, because the second part of it is all about his journey through the judicial system.
And you said he ends up in the Tombs, a notorious prison in New York City.
He was there for more than a year and a half waiting trial. And he goes to trial, and he does get convicted, but of manslaughter, and he winds up in the famous upstate New York prison down in Mora. So, but the journey to get there, and the lawyers and all the other political figures, the bail bondsmen, the witnesses, it's one after another of interesting side stories and tangents that you can't avoid going after.
Does he get out of prison? Do you know his story later or late in life?
He does get out of prison, and then he seems to disappear. But by that time, it's a very sad family story. These Flannellys, this branch, his parents had about 14 children. At least half of them didn't make it to adulthood. But he did have a brother who was a Jersey City police lieutenant. He had a brother who was a sanitary health inspector in Jersey City. But he had a sister who wound up in a mental institution. And by the time he would have been released, most of his family was dead, one way or another. His police officer brother was alive and a respectable person in Jersey City, but both his mother and father were deceased by the time he got out. So in the book, I don't discover where he went. I say he slipped his skin once again, you know, like an amphibian, and slithered off.
Interesting. Now, your third book, Canary in a Cage, the Smith-Bennett murder case, is about a Jersey City police officer who's murdered in his home in 1878. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, this is a quintessential Jersey story because it involves people who were originally from Monmouth County and wind up in Jersey City, and it ends up in this horrific thing. The police officer was Richard Harrison Smith. He really got his job through his brother. He had had a series of, not very important jobs, not very significant jobs, and went from job to job until his brother, who was an alderman, a councilman in Jersey City, fixed him up with a job on the police force. He had been, Richard Smith had been married, but he took up with a young girl whose family came from Monmouth County. Her mother was Dutch Reformed. Her father was from a Quaker family. She was, they were from the Long Branch area where she was born. And they moved to Jersey City probably because the father was like the 12th child or something, so there wasn't going to be any property in Monmouth County for him to farm. So they go to Jersey City. He dies very quickly in the Civil War years. And the mother, from the sedate Monmouth County community, religious community, she becomes the madam, so to speak, of a disorderly house, a pleasant name for gambling, drinking, and whatever.
Right.
And her daughters, her two daughters, are teenagers and operating that with her. Richard Smith, when he wasn't a police officer and was a married man, apparently frequented that disorderly house, set his eyes on Jenny Woolley, was her name, the Woolleys of Monmouth County, and eventually divorced his wife and married young Jenny. My belief is that she and her sister both married very young to escape the life their mother had made for them. It's very evident. And they marry in the early 1870s, Jenny Woolley and Richard Smith, and in 1878, Jenny wakes up in her bed in Jersey City, and she swears she finds her husband dead. He's bludgeoned and stabbed, and it's quite the bloody mess, and she hasn't a spot on her. And she says she was chloroformed and has no idea what happened. And she's immediately suspected. But the next day, the newspapers are basically saying she did it. And she's accused along with a young man whose mother owned a house. The mother passed away, and he rented rooms to Jenny and Richard Smith. And he's accused of he's like 18, accused of being infatuated with her and helping her. You know, a lot comes out, Mark, that the husband was a womanizer, you know, and the papers are just, in New Jersey and across the country, just inundated with the story that leads eventually to not one, but 3 trials.
So this must have been a sensational trial at the time. Did it make all the newspapers in the area?
It did, and beyond the area. Actually, both stories, that's Canary in a Cage and the story in Young and Wicked. I did a lot of newspaper archive research. They both hit all over the country.
Wow. So what was the outcome with Canary in a Cage?
The outcome was that in the first trial, a juror went literally insane, supposedly in reaction to the bloody evidence, so that was a mistrial. They were tried again, and they were convicted. They were set for execution by hanging. The scaffolding was up, and what happened was there was a plea made to George McClellan, who was governor of New Jersey, and he gave a stay of execution. and people raised money, including a famous opera singer, took an interest in the case, raised money, and they were able to argue for and get a third trial. And in the third trial, they were not convicted, but both of their lives were essentially ruined. And Jenny's, talk about downward spirals. Hers went on one. She went from being in a respectable family, married to a police officer, to living on canal boats down by the water in Jersey City, you know, a slum on the water. And I tracked her through criminal arrests and things like that in the newspapers into the 1890s. Not a pretty story.
Now, are you able to follow their whole lives? I mean, past the trial?
I do follow, particularly hers, and Covert Bennett, the young man who was accused of associating with her and helping her with the murder. He was a wannabe stage actor. So you find some things about him still trying to pursue his stage career, which was never very successful. But he did live well into the 20th century and at one point married a much older woman. Jenny disappears in the 1890s. Not long after I found her arrested with a really rough guy that she was living with in this canal boat community. And so I should mention that Canary in a Cage has some fictionalized aspects. So the trials are all 100% nonfiction, all that reporting, but there are many gaps in the story, many hypotheses, and nothing proved, you know, in an evidentiary way to say what really happened. So I've used the device of a reporter who covered the story, telling it in retrospect, around the time that Jenny disappears, and I hypothesize what happened to her at the end of her life as well.
Now, what drew you to that story? With Young and Wicked, it's a relation. What draws you to the other story?
I have to confess now, all right? When you love history and you spend a lot of time looking for topics in newspaper archives, your eye wanders. So you're looking and your eye wanders across the page. And being from Jersey City, being born there, I saw this in other research I was doing, and I went back. And, you know, I read a little and a little more and a little more. And the idea that a family from Monmouth County could fall into such disrepute from a family that probably descended from the 17th century in Monmouth County, right? And that it could all be tied up into this terrific tragedy. It was just very interesting. And also the fact that a couple got divorced in 1871, a very uncommon occurrence. And so read a little more, and can't stop.
Right. Now, your latest book, Jersey, Then Again, stories of authentic New Jersey people from the early 1800s up to the 1940s.
Right.
What is your favorite story from that book?
I have a few favorites.
And I should say there's 36 stories.
There's 36 short stories. Probably the ones that are favorites to me personally, there are a couple that have connections to my family. All right, so, but those aren't the ones that I think are the most necessarily the most interesting, although they are interesting. There's one about Snake Hill and an Italian immigrant who wound up there, and his family's fight into recent years to find his gravesite. And that resonated with me because my father was an Italian immigrant. So there are those like that have a tie to me personally. But the ones that are so sensational and unbelievable, like the story of so-called Dr. Oliver Phelps Brown, con man, patent medicine genius, and impresario, and who set up shop in Jersey City and offered cures for just about everything in a small bottle. And he wrote a book. That book is right next to you on herbal remedies. That's in print today, and that's a worthy resource. But he was making his money from the quick cure, and got a lot of publicity here and in London for his activities. Quite the guy.
And you brought some artifacts, I see. I mean, we have a photograph of him, and as well as a bottle of his herbal ointment.
Right, and it's still in there, corked, and we don't dare open it. A lot of claims were made that he used cannabis in his concoctions, but the New York Leader newspaper, which got a beat on him and went after him mercilessly, to no effect, by the way, they said that his medicines were tested and there wasn't a whiff or a whisper of cannabis in anything. It was another lie. So this is one of his ointments from that period, and I brought a letter also here that is from a patient. It was to a patient who had, in Christmas Day of 1868, he was still working, entrepreneurial person that he was, and all these $2.25 medicines, somehow this gentleman, Erastus Post out in Missouri, sent $25 for his concoction. So we think there was a bit of pyramiding once he got you in the web. And I did a little research on Erastus Post because I had an envelope with his address and everything. And it turned out he was a very successful farmer, very wealthy man. And census records said he suffered from an affliction of the spine. So I think we know what he needed his ointment for.
Wow. Now, you also have stories, or a story in the book about a survivor from the Titanic.
Right.
Can you tell a little bit about that?
Right, I can. I mentioned 4 people from Hudson County who were on the Titanic, and 2 of them survived and 2 of them didn't. And they're very poignant stories, of course. 2 of them were young men who had gone back to Europe, one to London and one to Ireland to see their mothers that they'd left behind. The boy who went to Ireland, he raved so much about the United States and life there that his younger brother begged him to take him. The mother in County Longford was reluctant, but she gave in, and both boys were lost in the disaster. There was a woman on ship who was a governess, Elizabeth Dowdell, and she was from Hudson County, and her charge was a young girl, I believe about 4 or 5 years old, and the mother of the child was an opera singer, and she was charged with bringing the child across the Atlantic to her grandparents, right? Because I guess the mother was touring and she was bringing the child. So they had a 3rd-class cabin, and Elizabeth tells, and I tell what she said, she tells the story of trying just to get up the stairs. It was bedtime, and everything, it was perfect. She put the child to bed, and then everything started going wrong. And she talks about she and the child being, by some very good men, being lifted off the ground. The stairs were so clogged that people couldn't get up from the lower deck, about men lifting them, pushing them up to the deck. And she talks about a ship's officer shooting 3 men who tried to keep the women out of the boat. And she and the child survived. They were picked up by the Carpathia, and they survived. And she brought the child safely to her grandparents. And then in 1958, many, many years later, because that was 1912, when she was 78 years old, Elizabeth attended the premiere of the movie A Night to Remember. And she was there to see the original movie on the Titanic sinking.
Wow, interesting. One of my favorite books was written by Walter Lord, A Night to Remember, which was used for the movie.
She was there to see it at 78 years old. She was there to see it.
So it seems like the common thread through all of this is that your inspiration comes from the genealogy research that you do, and it's these stories through this research that come to light that inspire you to tell these stories in your book. Is that?
That's pretty much the case, and it happens one of 2 ways. I write for a couple of history e-magazines, so I may be looking not for a genealogy story, but I may be looking for an interesting article topic, and then I wind up weaving in, even if I find some good resource material, I'll be curious and want to know what these people were about, what their parents were about, particularly if they're immigrants. So they wound up being overlaid for context and continuity.
Right.
The story.
Right.
Yeah.
And you use some great terms. I love the term disappear, because what you're talking about is in the research, in the historical research, in the archives, that people, they disappear from the historic record.
Yes.
And it's almost being a detective to try and trace them and see if you can find them in other records and pick up on their life later in time. Can you tell me a little bit about the work, the resources that you do to pull these stories together?
Sure. I spend a lot of time, as I said, in the online newspaper archives, and one of my favorites that I was introduced to by someone is Genealogy Bank, right? And I always recommend when I do a class in basic genealogy or hands-on genealogy research in a computer lab, I always recommend that people get at least a trial, 1-month subscription to Genealogy Bank. In New Jersey, for instance, if you're from reasonably close to Jersey City, you don't have to be there, but in that greater northern New Jersey area, they have, back into the 1860s, I believe, or 70s, the Jersey Journal, its predecessor, the Evening Journal. And down in Trenton area, I did family history research for family, deep roots, 200 years in Lambertville. They always made the Trenton Evening Times, right, because that was a local paper. So Genealogy Bank is ripe with those kind of stories, and you can find, people are amazed, and they say to me, my family was in the newspaper, you know, and sometimes it's something as simple as somebody had a Sweet 16 party, or they had a card party. There were social columns. So you find a great deal there about life, and it gives you context to build dimension when you're telling a story. Now, and it's a good resource. If you're doing genealogy, you want to layer on any newspaper articles and things you can find, again, for the same reason. I use Ancestry.com extensively. I use FamilySearch.org. I use Fold3 for military records. I'm always very happy when I find military records. My Flannelly great-great-grandfather came over during the famine as a 5-year-old. He was a Civil War soldier in the New Jersey Volunteers. So you never know what you're going to find. And I also recommend very highly a visit, and more than one, to the New Jersey State Archives. They're the best of people, professional, quality help. They can't do enough for you. And that's where I found, with their help, my great-great-grandfather's discharge from the New Jersey Volunteers. Never would have found it. They had it on microfilm.
Wow.
So those things, and when I do genealogy for people, or when I speak about it, I try to tell them that a family tree chart is a wonderful thing, but it's just a chart. If you can layer on the environment that people lived in, their occupations, military, health plagues like tuberculosis. My great-great-grandmother, who was related to Willie Flannelly, died of TB at a young age. If you can layer that on, you're breathing life into them. And your experience will be more than knowing who you're connected to. You will know them almost. I tell people you can almost project yourself into their lives.
And you're mentioning different types of resources out there. Certainly the newspapers, and what's great too is that a lot of them have been digitized.
Absolutely.
So, you know, they're online. They're also in a format that they're searchable, which is great. Instead of having to go through reels of microfilm, trying to find the information, it's very easy to access some of it. But also the importance too of going to places like the Division of Archives and Records Management in Trenton, and looking at the copies that they have there, because not everything is digitized, and the importance of doing that. Census records, and of course the layered approach, as you're mentioning as well, not newspaper stories, census records, other records that come together to tell that story.
You know, I'll tell you very quickly about a canary in a cage, an experience I had. I was reading through the newspaper archives. I discovered that there had been a sketch of her in one of the newspapers. Couldn't find it on any of the digitized microfilm. Went to the Library of Congress. They checked theirs. They said, you know, we all got our microfilm from the same place, no picture. I contacted 20 universities and libraries. The last one was the State of Pennsylvania Library. They had it in hard copy, and as a courtesy, they pulled it out and made a digital copy and sent me the image of her. I'd almost given up. So they had, you know, the physical hard copy, and they saved the day so everybody can see what she looked like.
And I mean, that must have been a defining moment for you. I mean, here you're buried in the historic record. You don't have an image. I mean, what was it like to open up that email and look at her?
What happened was, I didn't hear from them. They said they'd look, and then I was, you know, finishing up writing the book, and I called one more time, and I said, please don't think I'm a pest. And they went, oh my God, wait a minute, we thought we sent it to you. And they had there were two people, one thought the other one had sent it. And they said, thank God you called. So when I opened it, I was actually shopping, opened it on my phone, and I about screamed out loud. I was so thrilled. And they were so kind to do it for me, to go to the extra effort. And that's what I find. People who love history, people who love genealogy, the pay it forward random acts of kindness, not uncommon at all.
Right. That's great. That's great. So it sounds like it's a series of different pieces of the puzzle that you're pulling together, and at some point you've got enough to bring together for a story.
Yes.
What advice could you offer people who are interested in researching their own family history, or maybe wanting to uncover a story that's there?
I advise people to try trial subscriptions to the online things like Ancestry.com. You can get free for 2 weeks. And the reason I say that is because you have to see if you have an appetite for it. And what I usually say, as I did last week when I was talking to a group, don't get the free trial on Christmas Eve. Don't get it before the long weekend where you're going to LBI. Get it when you think you're ready to stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning because you're on the hunt, right? And try it out. If it frustrates you too much, find somebody who's more experienced for a buddy, but you'll get an idea if going through Genealogy Bank, you know, page after page searching, or the Library of Congress archives, newspaper archives, which are free, you'll get an idea if you have an appetite for it. And a lot of places, there are genealogical societies, join, because there's nothing people with an interest in history and genealogy like better than getting someone else involved and helping them get going.
Yeah. And the warning is that it's addictive, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. Oh yes. It's an addiction I never hope to be cured of.
Yeah, and I've heard genealogy is one of the fastest rising hobbies.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. I think it's in the top 3, and I think sometimes it's actually the top 1. And with Who Do You Think You Are on television now, there'll be a surge, no doubt, as people watch that and find out that, you know, if Cynthia Nixon can have an axe murderer in her family, think what you have.
Right. So, and another archives I should mention as well is New Jersey Special Collections at Alexander Library in Rutgers, which has some of the holdings of the New Jersey Genealogical Society, which you're a member of?
Yes, I am in the Hudson County Genealogical Society, and I love the Special Collections people because they actually wanted to have my books, you know, and have been very good to me. And also, don't forget the New Jersey Room at the Jersey City Free Public Library. It's a wonderful resource as well if your family's from up that way.
Yeah. So tell me about yourself. I mean, how did you get interested in genealogy research and history?
Yeah, I'm a commercial real estate banker by trade. That's how we fed ourselves, so to speak. But I adored my Irish grandmother, the subject of the memoir, my first book. She was born in 1904 in Jersey City. She was the granddaughter of famine immigrants, lost her mother at 9 to TB, and had a god-awful childhood. She was a domestic servant by the time she was 13, married at 16, wonderful marriage, but god-awful childhood. She never liked to talk about it because her father was alcoholic. And somehow in my late teens, I always loved history. I got the idea that I could figure out who she really was. She never knew a grandparent, nothing. And I could sort of jump her over that bad spot in her life and connect her to the greater story of her family. And you know how it was in the olden days. You know, you send out letters. There was nothing, you know, online. There was no online. Right. So she developed Alzheimer's and only lived to learn a small part of what I would eventually find out. So loving history and loving her, that's all it took.
And that's great that you understood that at a young age and you had the opportunity to talk to her. I mean, so many people discover their family history after so many have passed away.
Yeah, and she was reluctant because she was ashamed of her father's behavior. He deserted them after her mother died, and her mother had had a child out of wedlock at one point when she was a teenager. So she acted as if they were her shame because that's how it was then. So I finally, you know, good Irish girl, I got her over a couple of cups of tea and wore her down over the years, and little by little it came out, but what really came out was she hadn't a clue where she came from, except that she was Irish and proud of it.
Well, and that's great that you were able to, you know, to help fill in that story for her. Yeah.
Well, probably great, except she hated rattling skeletons in closets. So I always tell people if I was to get struck in the behind by a bolt of lightning, Kate probably saved her.
Well, Maureen, thank you for sitting down and sharing your knowledge about genealogy research and telling us these fascinating stories. Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.